May 27th, 1942. The basement of the old administration building, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer stared at the 5-digit number groups covering his desk, his eyes burning from another marathon shift in the windowless dungeon that housed Station Hypo. The benzodrine tablets kept him awake, but they couldn't stop the weight of responsibility pressing down on every decision. The pencil in his hand trembled slightly as he made another notation on the worksheet before him. Beside him, stacks of IBM punch cards towered like monuments to months of painstaking work. Each card represented hours of analysis, countless cross-references, and the accumulated knowledge of a team pushed beyond normal human limits. Everything depended on what these numbers meant. Everything. The war, the Pacific Fleet, thousands of American lives hanging in the balance. He reached for another punch card from the stack beside him, comparing code groups against the patterns his team had painstakingly assembled over 6 months of brutal work. In a war room 3 floors above, Admiral Chester Nimitz waited for an answer that would determine whether he gambled his last 3 aircraft carriers against a Japanese armada that outnumbered him in every category of ship. The stakes couldn't be higher. After Pearl Harbor, after months of defeats across the Pacific, this might be America's only chance to stop Japanese expansion. One mistake, one misread code group, one incorrect assumption, and the war in the Pacific could be lost before summer ended. Dyer's fingers moved across the IBM card sorter, searching for a pattern that might reveal the enemy's intentions. His colleague, Commander Joseph Rochefort, stood nearby in his characteristic bathrobe and slippers, having not left this underground bunker for days. The bathrobe wasn't eccentric behaviour, though many would later characterize it that way. The basement was stifling, inadequately ventilated, and the heat from the IBM machines made proper uniforms unbearable. Rochefort's approach was purely practical. Results mattered more than military protocol in this cramped, sweaty workspace, where the fate of nations was being decided by men hunched over code sheets and punch cards. Neither man knew that in the next week their work would change the course of World War II. The message intercepts were clear about one thing. The Imperial Japanese Navy was planning the largest operation since Pearl Harbor. 4 fleet carriers, dozens of supporting warships, and hundreds of the world's most experienced naval aviators were converging on a target designated by 2 letters in the Japanese code. AF. The question that haunted every man in that basement dungeon was simple but devastating. What was AF? Where would the Japanese strike next? Get it wrong, and America would lose the war in the Pacific before summer ended. The mathematics of potential disaster were brutally simple. Japan possessed 10 fleet carriers. America had 3 left in the Pacific, and one of those, Yorktown, was badly damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. If Nimitz positioned his carriers in the wrong place, if Station Hypo's analysis proved incorrect, the Japanese would achieve what Pearl Harbor had failed to accomplish, the complete destruction of American naval power in the Pacific. The transformation had begun 6 months earlier, on a morning that would forever change both nations. December 7th, 1941, dawned bright and peaceful across the Hawaiian Islands. Families were preparing for church services. Sailors aboard the battleships moored at Pearl Harbor were eating breakfast or catching a few extra hours of sleep on what should have been a quiet Sunday morning. The Pacific Fleet sat at anchor, powerful but complacent, unaware that a catastrophe was minutes away. At 7:55 that morning, peace died. 353 Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor in 2 devastating waves. The attack had been planned with meticulous precision by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist who understood both Japan's temporary advantage and America's long-term industrial superiority. His goal was simple: destroy the Pacific Fleet before America could fully mobilize its vast resources. Give Japan 6 months to a year to consolidate its conquests across the Pacific and Southeast Asia, then negotiate peace from a position of strength. Within 2 hours, the results were catastrophic. 8 battleships lay sunk or damaged. The USS Arizona exploded with such force that over 1,100 men died in seconds, entombed forever in their ship. A 1,800-pound armour-piercing bomb had penetrated the forward magazine, triggering an explosion so massive it lifted the 30,000-ton warship out of the water. Men who witnessed it from other ships would never forget the sight of Arizona rising, breaking apart, and settling to the harbour bottom in less than 9 minutes. The USS Oklahoma rolled over after torpedo hits opened massive holes in her port side, trapping 429 sailors and Marines inside her hull. Some survived in air pockets for days, their desperate hammering on the hull audible to rescue workers who couldn't reach them in time. The USS West Virginia settled onto the harbour bottom with 106 crew members lost. Unlike Oklahoma and Arizona, West Virginia would eventually be raised, repaired, and returned to service, fighting in major Pacific battles. But on December 7th, she was just another symbol of American vulnerability. Over 180 aircraft destroyed on the ground. Hangars and maintenance facilities demolished. 2,403 Americans dead, with the casualty breakdown revealing the comprehensive nature of the devastation. Navy 2,008, Marine Corps 109, Army 218, and civilians 68. Another 1,000 wounded. The Pacific Fleet, America's shield against Japanese expansion, lay shattered. Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet commander, watched his command burn from the windows of his headquarters. As he stood there, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster, a spent bullet shattered the glass beside him. He reached down to pick up the deformed projectile, examined it for a long moment, then said quietly to an aide standing nearby that it would have been merciful if it had killed him. Kimmel understood that his career was over, that he would bear responsibility for America's greatest military disaster. Within days, he would be relieved of command, replaced by Admiral Chester Nimitz. His request for a court-martial to clear his name would be denied. The blame for Pearl Harbor would follow him to his grave. But the attack, devastating as it was, had missed the most valuable targets. All 3 Pacific Fleet carriers were absent that morning. The Enterprise was returning from delivering aircraft to Wake Island, delayed by weather that would prove providential. The Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. The Saratoga sat in dry dock on the west coast undergoing maintenance. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, would win this war, though few yet understood that fundamental shift in naval power. The era of the battleship as the dominant naval weapon was ending. The era of carrier warfare was beginning, and America, through a combination of luck and Japanese miscalculation, still possessed its carriers. The Japanese had also ignored Pearl Harbor's fuel storage tanks, massive installations holding millions of gallons of oil that kept the fleet operational. They bypassed the repair facilities, the dry docks, the submarine base, and the naval yard infrastructure. Japanese planners assumed these would be irrelevant after the fleet was destroyed. They were catastrophically wrong. These intact facilities would enable Pearl Harbor to serve as the staging base for America's Pacific counter-offensive. The submarines based there would devastate Japanese merchant shipping. The repair yards would resurrect damaged ships, including some the Japanese believed they had sunk. Within months, Pearl Harbor would transform from a symbol of defeat into a hive of activity supporting the war effort. In that basement dungeon at Pearl Harbor, Commander Joseph Rochefort inherited an impossible task. Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit in Hawaii, had been tracking Japanese communications for years, but with limited success. The unit's official designation was Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, but everyone called it Station Hypo, using the phonetic code for H, standing for Hiaya, Hawaii, where one of the radio intercept towers was located. Before Pearl Harbor, they could read perhaps 10 to 15% of Japanese naval messages, and most of those only partially. It was enough to provide some intelligence value, but nowhere near enough to predict major operations like the Pearl Harbor attack. The main Japanese operational code, which American cryptanalysts designated JN25, consisted of approximately 30,000 to 33,000 five-digit number groups in actual use, each representing a word or phrase. The system was ingenious in its complexity. Each five-digit group from the codebook represented a specific word, phrase, or concept. To make decryption even more difficult, the Japanese super-enciphered these code groups using additive tables. Essentially, they encrypted the messages twice. First, the message was encoded using the codebook. Then, random five-digit numbers from separate additive books were added to each code group using non-carrying addition. The result was a message that appeared to be random numbers, resistant to frequency analysis and pattern recognition. Breaking this system required stripping off the additive layer through mathematical analysis, then determining the meaning of each five-digit code group through painstaking analysis of usage patterns across thousands of intercepted messages. The cryptanalysts had to identify which additive table had been used for each message, subtract those additives to reveal the original code groups, then figure out what each code group meant. And the Japanese changed both the codebooks and the additive tables regularly, forcing the cryptanalysts to start over repeatedly. The additive system used books containing 300 pages, each page listing 100 random five-digit numbers. To encrypt a message, the sender would start at a specified page and line, adding each successive additive to the corresponding code group. The receiver, knowing the starting point, could subtract the same additives to retrieve the original code groups. For American cryptanalysts, identifying which additive book and which starting point had been used was the first challenge. Sometimes they could determine this through radio call signs or message indicators. Other times, they had to test hundreds of possibilities. On December 1, 1941, just 6 days before Pearl Harbor, the Japanese had changed to a new version of JN25, designated JN25B by American analysts. The new version used a different codebook and new additive tables, forcing the cryptanalysts to start over from nothing. Every code group they had painstakingly identified became useless overnight. Every additive recovery technique they had developed might no longer work. They were back at the beginning, staring at streams of five-digit numbers that might as well have been hieroglyphics. Rochefort had known an attack was coming somewhere. Traffic analysis, the study of communication patterns without reading the actual messages, had shown increased Japanese naval activity. Radio call signs were changing more frequently. Message volume was spiking. Ships were moving. Something big was happening. But the Japanese strike force that attacked Pearl Harbor had maintained perfect radio silence during their voyage from Japan. The 6 carriers and their escorts had transmitted nothing. You cannot track ships that emit no signals. The Pearl Harbor Task Force had departed from Hitakapu Bay in the Kurile Islands on November 26th, taking a northern route across the Pacific where they were unlikely to encounter merchant ships or patrol aircraft. For 11 days, they maintained absolute communications discipline. Not a single radio transmission that could reveal their location or intentions. It was the most profound intelligence failure in American history. Cryptanalysts, traffic analysts, and intelligence officers had pieces of the puzzle, but not enough to see the complete picture. Some warnings had reached Washington. Japanese diplomatic messages, encrypted in a different system called Purple, had been partially decoded and showed increasing tension. But these diplomatic messages didn't contain military operational details. The attack came as a complete and devastating surprise. Rochefort understood that dwelling on failure would guarantee more disasters. The only path forward was through the enemy's communications. If Station Hypo could break JN25B, could read enough Japanese messages to understand their plans, perhaps Pearl Harbor need not be repeated. Perhaps intelligence could provide Admiral Nimitz with the one weapon that might offset Japan's current superiority, foreknowledge of enemy intentions. Joseph John Rochefort had been an unlikely candidate for such critical work. Born in Dayton, Ohio, on May 12, 1900, he had enlisted in the Navy in 1918 at age 17. When joining, he claimed his birth year as 1898 to appear older and more eligible for advancement, a falsification that would persist in his service records throughout his career. He was commissioned as an ensign after graduating from the Navy's Steam Engineering School at Stevens Institute of Technology on June 14, 1919. His early career suggested nothing special, just another young officer working his way through the ranks. But a fellow officer noticed something others had missed. Rochefort had a talent for solving crossword puzzles. He was excellent at auction bridge, an advanced card game requiring pattern recognition, memory, and logical deduction. These weren't trivial skills. They indicated a mind that could find patterns in complexity, that could make logical inferences from incomplete information. The officer recommended Rochefort for the Navy's cryptanalysis program, a small, specialized field that desperately needed talented recruits. In the early 1920s, naval cryptanalysis consisted of perhaps a dozen people working in cramped offices, barely funded, barely understood, trying to read the communications of potential adversaries. Rochefort proved to be a natural, but he possessed something beyond mathematical ability. In the mid-1920s, the Navy sent him to Japan for 3 years of language and cultural study, from 1929 to 1932. During those years, Rochefort lived in Tokyo, studied Japanese at the Navy's language school, and immersed himself in Japanese culture. He didn't just learn the language. He learned how Japanese people thought, how they communicated, how their military culture shaped their decision-making. He understood Japanese concepts of honor, duty, and hierarchical communication. This cultural knowledge, combined with his cryptanalytic training, made him uniquely qualified to lead Station Hypo when war came. His deputy and chief cryptanalyst was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a Naval Academy graduate who had trained under Agnes Driscoll, the legendary cryptanalyst who had pioneered the use of IBM punch card machines for code breaking. Driscoll, known throughout the cryptanalytic community as Miss Aggie, had been breaking codes since World War I. She had trained many of the Navy's best cryptanalysts and had made crucial breakthroughs against Japanese naval codes in the 1920s and 1930s. Her insight that IBM tabulating machines could be adapted for cryptanalysis had revolutionized the field. Dyer had been stationed at Pearl Harbor since 1936, longer than anyone else in the unit. He possessed an encyclopedic memory for code groups and an almost supernatural ability to recognize patterns in seemingly random numbers. He could look at a partially decoded message and intuit what the missing code groups might represent based on context and usage patterns from other messages. During the intense period leading up to Midway, Dyer often worked extended shifts with the help of benzodrine tablets to maintain alertness. The amphetamines were standard issue for personnel working critical assignments that required staying awake for extended periods. "I figured there were people out there getting shot at," Dyer later explained in oral history interviews. "If it should happen that it turned out to inflict some injury on my health in the long run, so what?" His colleagues joked that his desk sign was accurate when it read, "You don't have to be crazy to work here, but it helps." The sign, visible to anyone entering the cryptanalysis section, captured the reality of the work. The cryptanalysis section was indeed a strange place by military standards. Officers worked in bathrobes and slippers when the heat became unbearable in the basement facility. The IBM machines generated tremendous heat, and the basement's inadequate ventilation made proper uniforms impractical during marathon work sessions. Formal military discipline evaporated in favor of results. Rank mattered less than analytical skill. Rochefort fostered an environment where junior officers could question senior officers if the analysis demanded it, where credit for breakthroughs went to the team rather than individuals. As Rochefort often said, "We can accomplish anything provided no one cares who gets the credit." This philosophy was revolutionary in a military context where hierarchy and credit for success were usually paramount. But Rochefort understood that breaking JN25 required collaboration, cross-pollination of ideas, and the willingness to challenge assumptions regardless of who had made them. A junior enlisted radio man might notice a pattern that a senior officer had missed. A linguist might provide context that helped cryptanalysts understand the meaning of a partially decoded message. Everyone's insights mattered. This collaborative culture would prove essential when the pressure reached its peak in the spring of 1942. The linguistics section was led by Marine Captain Alva Laswell, who had studied Japanese for 3 years in Tokyo as part of the same exchange program that had trained Rochefort. During the Midway period, Laswell was actually promoted to Major on April 29, 1942, though he continued to be referred to by his previous rank in many accounts. He worked with 5 other linguists who represented the Navy's best Japanese language specialists. Their job was to translate the portions of messages that the cryptanalysts could decrypt, then work with intelligence analysts to determine what the messages meant in the larger context of Japanese naval operations. A partially decoded message mentioning carriers, aircraft, and fuel might mean a training exercise, or might mean an impending major operation. The linguists provided the cultural and linguistic context that helped distinguish between routine communications and critical intelligence. The traffic analysis section, led by Lieutenant Commanders Thomas Huckins and John Williams, focused on message externals rather than content. They tracked which stations were communicating with each other, monitored the volume of traffic between units, analysed priority designations, and mapped the patterns of communication that might reveal operational plans, even when the messages themselves remained encrypted. Traffic analysis could provide warning of major operations days or weeks before cryptanalysts could read enough messages to understand the details. An increase in message traffic between carrier divisions and supply units might indicate an impending sortie. Changes in radio call signs often preceded major operations. The sudden radio silence of a carrier division could mean they were underway for combat operations. This small team, working in a windowless basement with inadequate equipment and overwhelming workload, would soon face the most important intelligence challenge in American history. The work was painfully slow and frustrating. Each intercepted message arrived as a string of 5-digit number groups captured by radio intercept stations scattered across the Pacific. Radio men at stations in Hawaii, Australia, and other locations listened to Japanese naval frequencies 24 hours a day, transcribing every message they heard. These messages were forwarded to Station Hypo for analysis. First, the cryptanalysts had to strip off the additive encryption using mathematical analysis. The Japanese used additive tables where they added another 5-digit number to each code group using non-carrying addition. This meant that if a code group was 12345 and the additive was 67890, the encrypted result was 79135, adding each digit separately without carrying to the next position. Decryption required identifying which additive table had been used for each message, then subtracting the additive to reveal the original code group. This process alone could take hours for a single message. The cryptanalysts maintained massive files of recovered additives, organized by date and radio circuit, trying to identify patterns in how the Japanese used their additive tables. Once they had the original code groups, the real work began. The cryptanalysts maintained massive card catalogues representing years of accumulated knowledge about what each 5-digit number might mean. They made educated guesses based on context, comparing how specific code groups appeared in different messages, building slowly toward certainty. A code group that appeared frequently in messages between carriers might mean aircraft or aviation gasoline, or flight operations. One that appeared in logistics messages might mean fuel or supplies or ammunition. The IBM punch card machines helped them search through thousands of messages to find patterns, comparing usage contexts, identifying code groups that appeared together frequently, building networks of meaning. But the actual analysis required human intelligence, intuition, and often brilliant guesses. The machines could sort and search, but only human analysts could interpret the results, make intuitive leaps, and recognize meaningful patterns in the chaos of partially decoded messages. It was detective work of the highest order, requiring mathematical precision, linguistic knowledge, cultural understanding, and creative thinking. By March 1942, Station Hypo had made sufficient progress against JN-25 that they could provide useful intelligence about Japanese operations. The breakthrough hadn't come from a single dramatic moment, but from months of grinding work. Each recovered code group made subsequent messages slightly more readable. Each identified additive pattern made stripping the encryption slightly faster. Gradually, painfully, the opacity of Japanese communications began to yield. They had contributed intelligence to the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, helping the US Navy locate Japanese carriers and achieve a tactical draw that halted Japan's advance toward Australia. Coral Sea was significant for multiple reasons. It was the first naval battle in history where the opposing ships never came within sight of each other, all combat conducted by aircraft. It demonstrated that American carriers and pilots could fight effectively against the experienced Japanese carrier forces. And it damaged two Japanese carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, keeping them out of action for the next major operation. But the work remained frustratingly incomplete. Even at their best, they could read perhaps 30 to 40% of any given message. Many messages remained completely opaque. The Japanese continued to change codebooks and additives, requiring constant adaptation. And the pressure was relentless. Every message might contain intelligence that could save American lives or prevent another disaster. Every hour spent on a message that yielded nothing was an hour that could have been spent on something more productive. The cryptanalysts worked with the knowledge that their success or failure would be measured in American casualties. Then, in mid-May, they began intercepting messages about a massive operation. The traffic volume increased dramatically. Messages flew between the combined fleet headquarters, carrier divisions, submarine squadrons, battleship divisions, and invasion forces. All pointed to a major offensive scheduled for early June. Japanese operational security was good, but they had to communicate to coordinate a complex operation involving dozens of ships operating across thousands of miles of ocean. Each message, even if only partially readable, provided another piece of the puzzle. The target was designated AF in the Japanese location code system. Station Hypo believed AF meant Midway Island, a tiny atoll 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii that housed a small but strategically important American airbase. Midway consisted of two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, surrounded by a coral reef. The atoll measured just over 2 miles across, but its location made it crucial. If Japan captured Midway, they would threaten Hawaii itself and possess a base from which to interdict American communications across the Central Pacific. More importantly, a Japanese operation against Midway would force the remaining American carriers into a decisive battle. Admiral Yamamoto desperately wanted to destroy those carriers. He knew that Japan's industrial capacity could never match America's once American shipyards began producing carriers in quantity. Japan needed to win the war in 1942, while they still held numerical and operational superiority. But in Washington, the Navy's main cryptanalysis center, designated OP-20G, disagreed with Station HYPO's assessment. OP-20G, located in the Navy Department building in Washington, was ostensibly the superior organization. They had more personnel, better equipment, and the advantage of being located at the seat of naval power. But they lacked Station Hypo's specialized focus on the Pacific Theater and Rochefort's team's cumulative experience with Japanese naval communications. The Washington analysts believed AF might be the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. Some thought it could be a renewed offensive in the South Pacific toward Port Moresby, Fiji, or Samoa. Others feared an attack on Hawaii itself, or even the American West Coast. Without certainty about the target, Admiral Nimitz couldn't position his forces effectively. If he concentrated his carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. The disagreement intensified through late May. OP-20G had been recently reorganized. Lawrence Safford, a brilliant cryptanalyst known as the father of Navy cryptology, had been replaced by Commander John Redman, a communications officer with little cryptanalytic experience. Redman was competent in his previous field, but was, as one assessment noted, untrained in cryptanalysis. He brought a communications officer's perspective to an analytical organization, emphasizing proper procedures and chain of command over analytical insights. The bureaucratic battle between Station Hypo and OP-20G was about more than the location of the Japanese attack. It was about control of naval intelligence. Rochefort reported directly to Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, his friend from their years together studying Japanese in Tokyo, from 1929 to 1932. This direct communication worked brilliantly within the Pacific Theatre. Intelligence reached the commander who needed it without bureaucratic delays, but it infuriated the Washington command structure. Rochefort was bypassing the established chain of command, providing intelligence directly to the fleet commander instead of routing it through official channels and OP-20G for validation. From Washington's perspective, this violated proper procedure and undermined central control of intelligence analysis. From Rochefort's perspective, war didn't wait for bureaucracy, and Admiral Nimitz needed intelligence immediately, not after it had been reviewed, second-guessed, and delayed by multiple levels of command in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the Chief of Naval Operations who commanded the entire U.S. Navy, trusted his staff in Washington more than this informal arrangement in Hawaii. King was a brilliant but difficult man, known for his abrasive personality and his insistence on proper procedure. He disliked Rochefort intensely, viewing him as insubordinate and overly confident. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, resented Rochefort's independence and insisted that all intelligence analysis should be centralized in Washington, where it could be properly controlled and coordinated. The disagreement wasn't just about bureaucratic territory. Lives hung in the balance. If Nimitz positioned his 3 carriers near Midway and the Japanese attacked somewhere else, he would lose both his ships and the actual target of the Japanese offensive. With only 3 carriers against Japan's carrier fleet, America couldn't afford to be wrong even once. The Pacific Fleet couldn't sustain another Pearl Harbor-level disaster. If those 3 carriers were sunk, nothing would stand between Japan and Hawaii except a few submarines and some land-based aircraft. The West Coast would be vulnerable. The entire American position in the Pacific would collapse. Everything depended on determining what AF meant. Actually, it was Captain Wilfred J. Jasper Holmes, one of Station Hypo's staff members, who conceived the brilliant idea that would settle the question. Holmes was a submariner by training who had been assigned to intelligence work. He had the practical mindset of an operational officer combined with an analytical mind. He suggested that Midway send an uncoded message reporting that their water desalination plant had broken down and the base was running short of fresh water. If the Japanese intercepted this message and then reported that AF was short of water, Station HYPO would have definitive proof that AF meant Midway. It was a simple ruse, almost too simple to work. But simplicity was its strength. The Japanese were intercepting American communications just as the Americans were reading Japanese messages. If they overheard an unencrypted emergency message about water shortages at Midway, they would have no reason to suspect it was false. Water desalination equipment broke down regularly in tropical climates. A shortage would be a natural result of equipment failure. The Japanese intelligence services would report this useful tactical information about a potential target. Rochefort immediately recognized the brilliance of Holmes's idea and brought it to Edwin Layton, who presented it to Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz was the kind of commander willing to trust his intelligence officers and take calculated risks. He approved the plan immediately. The garrison commander at Midway received instructions via secure submarine cable, a communications method the Japanese couldn't intercept, to transmit an emergency request for water supplies in plain language that anyone monitoring radio frequencies could intercept. Around May 19th to 21st, 1942, Midway sent the message. The transmission went out in clear, unencrypted language, reporting equipment problems and requesting emergency water supplies from Pearl Harbor. Within 2 days, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese intelligence report. The message, sent in JN-25 and partially decrypted by Rochefort's team, stated that AF was experiencing water shortages. The proof was irrefutable. AF meant Midway. The Japanese were coming, but Washington remained skeptical. OP-20G insisted the attack would come in mid-June, while Station Hypo predicted late May or early June based on date indicators in the messages. The date-time groups in Japanese messages were super-enciphered beyond the standard JN-25 encryption, making them particularly difficult to decrypt. OP-20G hadn't broken the date-time encryption. Station Hypo had, thanks to a breakthrough by Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan. Finnegan, working under Dyer's supervision, discovered the method the Japanese used to encrypt their date-time groups. It was a separate system layered on top of JN-25, requiring additional mathematical analysis. Edwin Layton, in his memoir, And I Was There, specifically credited Finnegan with discovering the method that the Japanese had used to lock up their date-time groups. This breakthrough allowed Station Hypo to determine not just where the Japanese would strike, but when. On May 26th, they intercepted orders for 2 destroyer groups escorting invasion transports and successfully decrypted the date-time data using Finnegan's methods. The orders specified that the attack would occur on either June 4th or 5th, 1942. This level of precision was unprecedented. Admiral Nimitz would know not just where to position his forces, but when the enemy would arrive. The Washington analysts questioned whether Rochefort was being too aggressive in his interpretations, reading certainty into partial messages, letting his confidence overcome analytical caution. Admiral King remained unconvinced. The career consequences for Rochefort if he was wrong would be catastrophic. He would be blamed for misleading the Pacific Fleet commander, for risking America's last carriers on a faulty analysis. His career would be over, and worse, American sailors would die because of his mistake. But Rochefort stood by his analysis. His team had been working 18 to 24-hour shifts for weeks, surviving on coffee, cigarettes, and occasional sandwiches brought to the basement. The evidence was overwhelming. The volume of message traffic, the units involved, the logistical preparations, the date indicators, and the water ruse confirmation all pointed to the same conclusion. Midway, early June, 4 carriers. This was Japan's next major operation. By May 27th, Rochefort's team had decrypted enough messages to provide Nimitz with almost the entire Japanese order of battle. They knew the Japanese force would include 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the most experienced carrier division in the world. They knew the force would include 2 battleships, among them Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, the largest and most powerful battleship ever built. They knew about the 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 12 destroyers providing escort. They knew about approximately 250 carrier aircraft, flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of combat experience. They knew about the invasion force carrying 5,000 troops scheduled to land on Midway on June 7th. The intelligence was so detailed that Nimitz's staff could predict the Japanese approach route, the timing of the first airstrikes, and even the composition of the attack formations. On May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, Rochefort and Layton presented this intelligence to Admiral Nimitz. The room was crowded with staff officers, many skeptical that such detailed intelligence could be accurate. Rochefort, still in his bathrobe, walked them through the analysis, explaining how each conclusion had been reached, showing them the partially decrypted messages, demonstrating the analytical process that had yielded such specific information. No navy in history had ever possessed such complete intelligence about an enemy's operational plans before the battle began. It was a cryptanalytic achievement that would never be repeated at this scale. The combination of Station Hypo's breakthrough against JN-25, the volume of Japanese communications, and the Japanese assumption that their codes were secure had created a perfect intelligence window. Nimitz now knew things that many Japanese officers didn't know. He understood Yamamoto's strategy better than some of Yamamoto's subordinates. But intelligence alone doesn't win battles. Nimitz faced a terrible calculus. He had 3 carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Enterprise and Hornet were in good condition, but Yorktown was badly damaged. The carrier had been so severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea that initial assessments estimated 3 months of repairs at Puget Sound Navy Yard on the west coast. Structural damage to the flight deck, damage to the fuel system, fires that had killed dozens of crew members. Yorktown should have been out of action until late summer. Nimitz made one of the most consequential decisions of the war. He told the repair crews at Pearl Harbor they had 3 days to make Yorktown battle-worthy. Not fully repaired, not restored to perfect condition, but functional enough to launch and recover aircraft, to fight one more battle. The repair crews thought it was impossible. They were being asked to accomplish in 72 hours what would normally take 90 days. What followed was a near miracle of industrial effort. Yorktown entered Dry Dock No. 1 at 11 a.m. on May 28th. Over 1,400 workers swarmed the ship, working around the clock. Welders repaired structural damage to the flight deck. Electricians restored damaged systems. Damage control teams patched holes. Some repairs were temporary expedients that would require proper fixing later, but they would hold for one more battle. The ship was still carrying some repair crew when she steamed out the morning of May 30th, heading to join Enterprise and Hornet. Approximately 48 to 72 hours of actual repair work, compressed into 3 calendar days. A remarkable achievement that enabled Yorktown's crucial participation in the battle. Against Japan's 4 fleet carriers and experienced aviators, Nimitz could field 3 carriers with less experienced pilots. The Japanese had been at war since 1937. Their naval aviators had hundreds of hours of combat experience in China and across the Pacific. They had trained together for years, developing sophisticated tactics. Their aircraft carriers had operated together as a strike force since the beginning of the war, achieving perfect coordination. American carrier doctrine was still evolving. Many American pilots had never seen combat. Some had only basic training in carrier operations. The disparity in experience was enormous. The numbers were daunting in every category. But Nimitz had the ultimate advantage that Rochefort had given him: perfect intelligence. He positioned his carriers at a location they codenamed Point Luck, 350 miles northeast of Midway, where they could ambush the Japanese carriers after the first strike on Midway's airfields. The Japanese, confident that they had achieved surprise, expected to attack the undefended island, recover their aircraft, rearm them with different weapons, and then hunt for American carriers they assumed were still at Pearl Harbor, or at least several days away from the battle area. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, commanding the Japanese carrier strike force, believed he would have hours to conduct operations before encountering any American opposition. He expected to bomb Midway into submission, then spend the afternoon searching for American ships, if any were nearby. The possibility that 3 American carriers were already positioned northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush, never occurred to him. Japanese naval intelligence had assured him that Yorktown was sunk at Coral Sea, that Enterprise and Hornet were thousands of miles away, and that no American carriers could possibly be near Midway when his forces arrived. Nimitz's gamble was almost incomprehensible in its boldness. If Rochefort was wrong about the location, timing, or Japanese force composition, the Pacific Fleet would be destroyed, and Hawaii would be defenseless. If Washington's analysis was correct and the attack came elsewhere, Nimitz would lose both his carriers and the actual Japanese target. If the intelligence was right, but the battle went badly, America would lose its last 3 carriers, and the war in the Pacific would be lost. Nimitz was staking everything on the analysis of intercepted messages performed by a small group of exhausted men working in a basement with primitive equipment. Everything depended on the analysis of intercepted messages, on the accuracy of code group identifications, on the correct interpretation of partially decoded messages, on the synthesis of fragments into a coherent picture. Rochefort and his team had provided Nimitz with intelligence of unprecedented quality. Now American sailors and aviators would have to execute the battle that intelligence had made possible. On June 3, 1942, Navy patrol planes spotted the Japanese fleet approaching Midway from the northwest, exactly where Rochefort had predicted. The PBY Catalina flying boats, operating at the extreme limit of their range, found the invasion transport group first, then the carriers. Each sighting report confirmed Station HYPO's analysis. Location, timing, force composition, all matching the intelligence. Nimitz's gamble was validated. The trap was set. At dawn on June 4th, 108 Japanese aircraft launched from the 4 carriers and headed for Midway. 36 Aichi D-3A dive bombers, 36 Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers, armed with high-explosive bombs for land targets, and 36 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters. American radar on Midway detected them 93 miles out, at 05:45 hours. The defenders scrambled every available aircraft to intercept. The Japanese strike devastated Midway's facilities, destroying fuel tanks, hangars, and the command post. American fighters tried to intercept but were overwhelmed by the Zeros. Marine Corps pilots in obsolete F-2A Buffalo fighters suffered terrible casualties. Ground fire damaged some Japanese aircraft, but the attack achieved most of its objectives. The Japanese formation commander, examining the results, radioed back that a second strike would be necessary. Midway's runways were damaged but still operational. Defending aircraft had survived. The base wasn't completely suppressed. But the first real shock came with American aircraft from Midway attacking the Japanese carriers. Marine Corps dive bombers, Army Air Force B-17 bombers, and Navy torpedo bombers struck at the Japanese fleet without success, suffering heavy casualties. But they forced the Japanese to keep their combat air patrol engaged. They disrupted Japanese operations. They demonstrated that American forces were more capable and determined than Japanese intelligence had suggested. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo faced a critical decision. His aircraft were returning from Midway, low on fuel and needing to land. The after-action assessment suggested a second strike on Midway would be necessary to completely suppress the base. Following doctrine, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike. Ordnance crews began removing the armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes from the aircraft spotted on the hangar decks, replacing them with high-explosive bombs designed for land targets. Then, at 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A Japanese scout plane, launched late due to a catapult problem, reported sighting 10 American surface ships to the northeast. The scout's initial report didn't specify ship types, but the presence of any American ships in the area was unexpected. Nagumo suddenly faced the possibility of American carriers in the area, something he had been assured was impossible. Yorktown was supposedly sunk. Enterprise and Hornet were supposedly nowhere near Midway. Nagumo immediately halted the rearming process and ordered his aircraft switched back to anti-ship weapons, torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. The ordnance crews reversed course, removing the land attack bombs they had just loaded, bringing up anti-ship weapons from the magazines. The flight decks and hangars of all 4 Japanese carriers became scenes of controlled chaos. Bombs that had just been mounted on aircraft were removed and sent below. Torpedoes were brought up from magazines and attached to aircraft. Fuel lines remained connected to planes as they were being rearmed. Loose ordnance, both bombs and torpedoes, piled up on deck because there wasn't time to properly store everything below while simultaneously preparing for launch. It was the most dangerous situation possible on an aircraft carrier. Fully fueled planes, surrounded by loose bombs and torpedoes, with aviation gas fumes thick in the air. At 10:22 a.m., American dive bombers arrived overhead. 3 squadrons of Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown had become separated from their fighters and torpedo bombers during the flight to the target, but they had found the Japanese carriers at the perfect moment. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's air group, had extended his search beyond the expected intercept point, gambling his fuel reserves on finding the Japanese. His decision paid off when he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing to rejoin the carrier force. The Japanese carriers were attempting to launch their strike against the American fleet. Their decks were crowded with fully armed and fueled aircraft. Their combat air patrol fighters were at sea level, having just finished destroying the last of the American torpedo bomber attacks. The Devastator torpedo bombers from all 3 American carriers had attacked with suicidal courage, knowing their slow aircraft stood little chance against Zeros. 41 torpedo bombers attacked. 35 were shot down. Not a single torpedo hit. But their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down to sea level and disrupted Japanese defensive coordination. The Dauntless pilots pushed over into their dives from 14,000 feet, screaming down at speeds approaching 250 knots. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly coordinated attacks, they destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. The timing was so precise, the attacks so well executed, that to Japanese observers it seemed like a single, overwhelming assault. The Akagi took a bomb through the flight deck that detonated in the hangar bay among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions ripped through the ship. Fires spread instantly through aviation fuel spilled on the hangar deck. Within minutes, Akagi was burning out of control. Admiral Nagumo and his staff had to abandon the flagship. The Kaga suffered 4 bomb hits in rapid succession. The forward elevator was blown out of its shaft. The bridge structure was wrecked. Fires engulfed the ship from bow to stern. Ammunition and fuel explosions continued for hours. Kaga's captain ordered abandon ship, but stayed aboard himself, going down with his command. The Soryu took 3 direct hits. All 3 struck within seconds of each other, devastating the ship. The flight deck ruptured. The hangar became an inferno. Soryu's crew fought to save their ship, but the damage was catastrophic. After 20 minutes of firefighting, the captain ordered the crew to abandon ship. He remained aboard. Soryu sank 7 hours later, taking 711 men with her. All 3 carriers were doomed within minutes, their crews abandoning ship as uncontrollable fires consumed the vessels. Japanese damage control procedures, which emphasized firefighting over flooding control, couldn't cope with the scale of the damage and the fuel fires. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, had become separated from the others earlier in the day and escaped the initial attack. She launched strikes that badly damaged the Yorktown, hitting the American carrier with bombs and torpedoes that brought her to a halt. But American dive bombers found the Hiryu later that afternoon and left her burning like her sister ships. By evening on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were sinking or abandoned. Japan lost 3,057 men, including many of her most experienced pilots and maintenance crews. Among the dead were some of the most skilled aviators in the world, men who had bombed Pearl Harbor, conquered the Philippines, destroyed the Prince of Wales and Repulse, and dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Their loss would prove impossible to replace. The United States lost the Yorktown, which succumbed to submarine torpedoes 2 days later while under tow. The Japanese submarine the 168 found the carrier on June 6th and put 2 torpedoes into her hull. A 3rd torpedo sank the destroyer Hamon alongside Yorktown. The carrier rolled over and sank on June 7th. American casualties totaled 362 men. In approximately 6 minutes of perfectly executed dive bombing, the war in the Pacific had changed. The transformation was total and irreversible. Japan had begun the war with overwhelming carrier strength. After Midway, she had lost 4 of her 6 fleet carriers and could not replace them. Japanese shipyards could not match American production capacity. The United States was about to commission dozens of new carriers from its enormous industrial base. The Essex-class carriers were already under construction, each one larger and more capable than the carriers lost at Midway. Japan would never again conduct offensive operations. Every subsequent battle would be defensive, attempting to hold what she had already captured. The mathematics of American industrial power would grind Japan down slowly but inevitably. The transformation that Rochefort's intelligence had made possible would shape the entire Pacific War. And it had all begun with 5-digit number groups on punch cards in a basement in Hawaii. The timing of the dive bomber attack, arriving just as the Japanese carriers were most vulnerable, was partly luck, but also partly the result of understanding the enemy's operational procedures well enough to predict when they would be rearming aircraft. None of that would have been possible without the breakthrough against JN-25 and the brutal analytical work that allowed Rochefort's team to read Japanese intentions. But recognition for this achievement would prove elusive and politically fraught. The bureaucratic warfare between Station Hypo and OP-20G in Washington intensified after Midway rather than resolving. Both organizations claimed credit for the victory. Washington argued that their analysis had contributed to the success. Station Hypo insisted their work had been decisive. The dispute became personal and bitter. Commander John Redman, who led OP-20G, resented Rochefort's independence and his direct relationship with Nimitz. Redman's brother, Rear Admiral Joseph Redman, held a senior position in naval communications and supported his brother's efforts to centralize control of cryptanalysis in Washington. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations, supported the Redman brothers. King believed in centralized command and distrusted Rochefort's informal methods. In October 1942, just 4 months after Midway, Rochefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo and reassigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. The official reason was that he needed sea duty for career advancement. Everyone understood it as punishment for insubordination. Rochefort had been right about Midway. His analysis had enabled the greatest American naval victory of the war, but he had bypassed the chain of command, antagonized powerful officers in Washington, and made enemies of the Redman brothers. Admiral Nimitz was reportedly enraged but couldn't prevent the removal. King commanded the entire Navy. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet. In a dispute between fleet commanders and the Chief of Naval Operations, CNO won. Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway, citing his sustained superior performance and noting that his work contributed in large measure to the victory. King's office denied the award. Rochefort would never return to cryptanalysis. He commanded the floating dry dock, a backwater assignment for an officer of his capabilities. Later, he was assigned to administrative duties at Pacific Fleet headquarters. He never received the sea command he wanted. He never advanced beyond the rank of captain. When he retired in 1953, it was without the recognition his Midway achievement deserved. The denial of recognition was a grave injustice that would take decades to correct. But the work continued. Throughout the rest of 1942 and into 1943, Station Hypo continued reading Japanese naval communications, though under new leadership. The intelligence supported the Guadalcanal campaign, where American and Japanese forces fought a brutal 6-month battle for control of a strategic island. Intelligence from decrypted messages helped position American ships for naval engagements, warned of Japanese reinforcement convoys, and provided strategic warning of Japanese intentions. The intelligence supported the island-hopping strategy across the Central Pacific, as American forces bypassed strong Japanese garrisons and seized less defended islands, cutting Japanese supply lines and moving ever closer to Japan. Each operation benefited from signals intelligence that revealed Japanese dispositions, identified weak points, and warned of counterattacks. Station Hypo's work eventually contributed to Operation Vengeance in April 1943, when American fighters intercepted and shot down Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft based on decrypted flight plans. Yamamoto was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville to inspect frontline units. Station Hypo intercepted and decrypted messages containing his complete itinerary, including departure time, route, and arrival time. The intelligence went up the chain to President Roosevelt, who authorized the mission. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters flew from Guadalcanal, intercepted Yamamoto's transport exactly on schedule, and shot it down. Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, died in the jungle of Bougainville. His loss was a devastating blow to Japanese morale. Thomas Dyer remained at Station Hypo throughout the war, rising to captain. His work on JN-25 and his supervision of the critical breakthroughs that enabled Midway would make him known within cryptologic circles as the father of machine cryptanalysis. After the war, he became one of the 3 primary cryptanalytic trainers for both the Armed Forces Security Agency and later the National Security Agency, along with William Friedman and Lambros Kalimachos. His techniques for using IBM machines in cryptanalysis influenced a generation of signals intelligence professionals. Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer who had championed Rochefort's analysis and presented it to Nimitz, served throughout the Pacific War and retired as a rear admiral. He spent decades after the war working to get recognition for Rochefort's contributions. His memoir, And I Was There, published in 1985, provided detailed documentation of Rochefort's achievements and the injustice of his treatment. Layton never stopped advocating for his friend. Joseph Finnegan, who discovered how to decrypt the Japanese date-time groups, continued his cryptanalytic career and became a leading figure in post-war signals intelligence. His breakthrough had been crucial to determining the attack date, allowing Nimitz to position forces with perfect timing. Without knowing the date, American carriers might have arrived too early and exhausted their fuel, or too late and missed the battle entirely. The linguists, traffic analysts, and cryptanalysts who had worked those impossible hours in the dungeon at Pearl Harbor went on to various careers. Most never spoke publicly about their wartime work due to classification restrictions that lasted for decades. The institutional memory of their achievement remained classified until the 1970s, more than 30 years after the war ended. Families didn't know what their fathers and husbands had done. Neighbors didn't understand why certain men had spent the war in Hawaii rather than fighting. The cryptanalysts carried their secrets in silence, unable to claim credit for achievements that had changed history. The true scope of American success against Japanese codes wasn't declassified until the mid-1970s, when the National Security Agency began releasing historical documents about World War II cryptanalysis. Only then could historians and the public understand how thoroughly American cryptanalysts had penetrated Japanese communications, how much intelligence had shaped major battles, and how critical the work of men like Rochefort and Dyer had been to Allied victory. In 1980, a campaign began to secure proper recognition for Rochefort's contributions. Admiral Donald Mack Showers, who had worked in naval intelligence during the war and later served at the CIA, led the effort. He was joined by Navy Secretary John Lehman, who understood both the historical importance and the injustice of Rochefort's treatment. The campaign gained momentum as classified documents became available to historians and the full story of Station Hypo's achievements could finally be told. On May 30, 1986, almost exactly 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan awarded the Distinguished Service Medal to Joseph Rochefort posthumously. Rochefort had died on July 20, 1976, never knowing he would finally receive the recognition he had earned, but been denied. His children accepted the medal on his behalf at a White House ceremony. The citation praised his sustained superior performance and noted that his intelligence work contributed in large measure to the victory of the United States forces at Midway. It was an understated description of the most important intelligence achievement in American military history. The story of how one man's code-breaking expertise changed the course of World War II reveals profound truths about intelligence, leadership, and innovation. Rochefort succeeded because he combined multiple rare skills: mathematical ability for cryptanalysis, linguistic and cultural knowledge of Japan gained during 3 years of study in Tokyo from 1929 to 1932, intelligence analysis expertise, and leadership skills that fostered collaborative innovation. His willingness to bypass bureaucratic channels to get intelligence to the commander who needed it showed moral courage. His insistence on accuracy despite pressure from Washington demonstrated intellectual integrity. His creation of an environment where junior officers could contribute fully regardless of rank showed enlightened leadership. He understood that breaking JN-25 required every member of his team working at maximum capability, sharing insights, challenging assumptions, and synthesizing fragments into coherent intelligence. Thomas Dyer's willingness to work extended shifts with pharmaceutical assistants showed dedication that went beyond reasonable expectations. The entire Station Hypo team demonstrated that impossible challenges could be met through collaboration, innovation, and relentless effort. They understood that what they were doing mattered more than personal comfort, sleep, or health. The men defending Midway, the pilots flying into combat, the sailors manning battle stations depended on the accuracy of Station Hypo's intelligence. The technical achievement was extraordinary. Breaking JN-25 required not just mathematical skill, but intuition, pattern recognition, and the ability to think like the enemy. The IBM punch card machines helped with sorting and searching, but the actual breakthroughs came from human intelligence applying creativity to seemingly intractable problems. The scale of the task was overwhelming. With approximately 30,000 to 33,000 code groups in actual use, each message presented millions of potential meanings. Finding the right interpretation required years of accumulated knowledge, brilliant guesses validated through comparison with other messages, and the synthesis of partial information into actionable intelligence. There were no computers in the modern sense, no automated analysis tools, no machine learning algorithms. Just pencils, paper, punch cards, and human minds working at the absolute limits of their capabilities. The cryptanalysts worked with the knowledge that every hour counted, that the next message might contain intelligence that could save thousands of lives. The strategic impact extended far beyond Midway. Rochefort's work established that signals intelligence could provide decisive advantage in modern warfare. It demonstrated that investing in cryptanalysis, even when the work seemed impossibly difficult, could yield results that changed the course of history. It showed military commanders that trusting intelligence analysts and acting on their assessments, even when those assessments contradicted conventional wisdom, could lead to victories that would otherwise be impossible. The transformation of the Pacific War that began at Midway created ripple effects that would shape the world for decades. Japan's defeat led to American occupation and the transformation of Japan into a democratic ally. The Pacific Island chains would become key positions in the Cold War. The carrier aviation tactics developed during the Pacific War would dominate naval warfare for the next 8 decades. The cryptanalysis techniques pioneered at Station Hypo would evolve into the massive signals intelligence infrastructure of the National Security Agency. The lessons learned from breaking JN-25 influenced American approaches to signals intelligence throughout the Cold War and beyond. The integration of cryptanalysis, traffic analysis, and operational intelligence became standard practice. The use of IBM machines and later computers for cryptanalysis revolutionized the field. The understanding that signals intelligence required not just technical skill, but cultural knowledge and operational expertise shaped how intelligence agencies recruited and trained personnel. In 1985, a reunion was held for surviving members of Station Hypo and other Pacific War cryptanalysts. Men in their 60s and 70s gathered to remember their younger selves working impossible hours in that basement dungeon, racing against time to give their forces any possible advantage. They shared stories of the dive bomber attack that destroyed 3 carriers in minutes, of the water ruse that proved AF meant Midway, of the extended shifts fueled by coffee and benzodrine, of Rochefort working in his bathrobe because the heat made uniforms unbearable. Some wept remembering colleagues who hadn't survived the war. Others marvelled at what they had accomplished with such primitive tools. All understood that they had been part of something remarkable, that their work had mattered in ways that shaped history. The reunion provided the first opportunity for many of them to speak openly about their wartime experiences, to share stories that classification had kept secret for 4 decades. Edwin Layton, then in his 80s, spoke about what that team had achieved. He recalled Rochefort's certainty when presenting the intelligence to Nimitz on May 27, 1942, at the Pacific Fleet Staff Conference, the way he had staked his career on the analysis, the moral courage it took to insist on an answer when Washington disagreed. He remembered May 27, 1942, when Rochefort had finally told Nimitz exactly where and when the Japanese would strike. The precision of that intelligence had been stunning. The American carriers had been positioned exactly where they needed to be. The Japanese had sailed into a perfectly prepared ambush. None of it would have happened without men like Rochefort, who refused to accept that the problem was too difficult, who kept working when every reasonable person would have given up, who believed that intelligence and analysis could change the course of history. The reunion concluded with a statement that captured the essence of what Station HYPO had accomplished. One of the surviving cryptanalysts stood and said what many were thinking. His words summarized not just their individual experiences, but the larger meaning of their achievement. We came to this war as mathematicians, linguists, engineers, men who solved puzzles. We left as the people who had changed history. Not through violence, but through understanding. Not through force, but through intelligence. We read the enemy's mind, and in doing so, we saved thousands of American lives and shortened a terrible war. Some of us were recognized. Many were not. Joseph Rochefort gave his career to do what was right rather than what was politically safe. Thomas Dyer worked until exhaustion during extended shifts fueled by benzodrine. Every man and woman in that basement gave everything they had because they understood what failure would mean. We proved that knowledge is power, that understanding your enemy can defeat him as surely as superior weapons, that a small group of dedicated people with the right skills and the will to succeed can achieve things that seem impossible. The Japanese codes looked unbreakable, approximately 30,000 to 33,000 code groups, super-enciphered, constantly changing. But we broke them. We didn't break them because we were lucky. We broke them because we were smart, because we worked harder than anyone thought possible, because we refused to quit, because we understood that everything depended on success. The Battle of Midway was won by pilots who flew into overwhelming anti-aircraft fire, by aircraft mechanics who prepared planes under impossible conditions, by commanders who made bold decisions, by sailors who fought damage control when their ships were sinking. But it was made possible by intelligence, by codebreakers who gave Admiral Nimitz the one thing he needed most, certainty about enemy intentions, delivered with conviction on May 27, 1942. To the memory of Joseph Rochefort, born May 12, 1900, who died before receiving the recognition he earned on May 30, 1986. To Thomas Dyer and every cryptanalyst who sacrificed sleep, health, and sometimes sanity during those grueling extended shifts to read the enemy's messages. To the linguists who translated our findings, to the traffic analysts who found patterns in chaos, to the radio intercept operators who captured the signals we analyzed, to everyone who worked in that basement and never told their families what they had done because the work remained classified for decades. You changed history. You saved lives. You proved that intelligence in both senses of the word, information and wisdom, can be the most powerful weapon in war. The story of how we broke JN-25 and gave America the intelligence that won Midway is ultimately a story about human capability at its highest level. You don't need to be the strongest to win. You don't need the most weapons. You need to understand your enemy better than he understands you. You need to work harder than seems humanly possible. You need to combine multiple disciplines: mathematics, linguistics, cultural understanding, intuition and intelligence analysis into actionable knowledge. You need leaders brave enough to trust intelligence even when it contradicts expectations. You need teams that function as collaborative units where ego takes a back seat to mission. We did all of that, and in doing so we demonstrated that intelligence work, patient, analytical, unglamorous work performed in basements by people who never sought recognition, can be just as decisive as the most dramatic military operations. 5 to 6 minutes of dive bombing destroyed 3 Japanese carriers. But those minutes happened because of 6 months of cryptanalysis, because Joseph Rochefort believed it was possible to read Japanese naval messages, because Thomas Dyer would work extended shifts when necessary, because a team of mathematicians, linguists and analysts refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable, because Admiral Nimitz trusted intelligence enough to risk everything on it. We won the war in the Pacific many times over the course of 4 years, but we won it decisively on June 4, 1942, when American dive bombers found Japanese carriers at exactly the moment of maximum vulnerability. That wasn't luck. That was intelligence. That was what happens when you invest in understanding your enemy, when you refuse to quit despite impossible obstacles, when you create teams of brilliant people and give them the resources and freedom to do their work. The lesson of Midway is simple but profound. Knowledge is power. Understanding is victory. Intelligence, in every sense of that word, can change the world. We proved it, and in proving it, we helped save civilization from tyranny. The room erupted in applause. Men who had maintained silence about their wartime work for 4 decades, who had never been able to tell their families what they had done, who had watched others receive recognition while they remained anonymous, finally heard the acknowledgement they deserved. The transformation from anonymous cryptanalysts to recognized heroes took 40 years, but the achievement itself was timeless. The Battle of Midway was won in many places. On the flight decks of American carriers where pilots launched into combat against overwhelming odds. In the cockpits of dive bombers where young men pushed into steep dives through anti-aircraft fire. In damage control parties on the Yorktown fighting to save their ship. In the command decisions made by Admiral Nimitz and his carrier commanders. But it was made possible in a basement at Pearl Harbor, where a small group of cryptanalysts, linguists and analysts transformed impossible into inevitable, where 5-digit number groups became the keys to Japanese intentions, where exhausted men worked around the clock because they understood that failure meant disaster, where innovation, collaboration and relentless determination combined to achieve what had seemed impossible. Joseph Rochefort died in 1976 in Torrance, California, at the age of 76. He died before receiving his medal, before the full story could be told, before the world would know what he and his team had accomplished. But his legacy lives on in the intelligence community he helped create, in the methods he pioneered, in the proof he provided that understanding your enemy can be the most powerful weapon of all. The codebreaker who read Japanese minds and changed history. The man in the bathrobe who worked in a basement and won the Pacific War. The officer who sacrificed his career to do what was right. The mathematician who proved that knowledge truly is power. That was Joseph Rochefort. That was Station Hypo. That was how America learned to read every Japanese message, and in doing so, learned how to win a war that had seemed unwinnable in the dark days after Pearl Harbor. The story of JN-25 and the code breakers who conquered it stands as one of history's greatest intelligence achievements. It demonstrates that wars are won not just by force of arms, but by force of mind. That the most powerful weapons are sometimes mathematical formulas, linguistic expertise, and the will to work harder than seems humanly possible. That a small group of dedicated people in a basement can change the course of history as surely as entire armies. June 4th, 1942, changed the Pacific War. But the true transformation began earlier, in the patient work of cryptanalysts who refused to accept that Japanese codes were unbreakable, who worked extended shifts under impossible conditions, who proved that intelligence could be as decisive as aircraft carriers, who demonstrated that understanding your enemy is the first step to defeating him. They were mathematicians, linguists, sailors, marines, and officers. They were the code breakers who gave America the intelligence that won the war in the Pacific. They were the proof that knowledge truly is the ultimate power.